They swore it never existed, that such a recording could never have survived the careful curation of academic legacy. If it had ever been made, they assured us, it would have been destroyed long ago, sealed away in fireproof vaults, or quietly buried beneath the weight of scholarly decorum. Yet here it sits before us, a ghost made tangible, recorded in the autumn of 1959 in the quiet lakeside sanctuary of Küsnacht, where Carl Gustav Jung once dreamed himself into the mythology of the modern mind. What you are about to witness was never intended for the world beyond those walls. The Foundation denied its existence for more than 6 decades. The original reel bore only the cryptic designation Red Book Supplemental Audio Artifact B, catalogued in shadows and forgotten by all but the most trusted circle of Jungian custodians. But in 2023, during a routine digitization project undertaken by Zurich's Jung Institute, fate intervened. Tucked beneath his annotated copy of Mysterium Coniunctionis, inside a mislabeled leather folder that had escaped notice for 64 years, this singular artifact waited in silence. Until now. History remembers Jung as the architect of analytical psychology, the visionary who gifted us archetypes and synchronicity, who mapped the vast territory of the collective unconscious, like some explorer of inner worlds. His break with Freud was not born of rebellion, but of reverence for something deeper, something that called to him from the ancient places where science meets mystery. While early 20th century psychiatry marched confidently toward behaviorism and rational metrics, Jung chose a different path, walking backward into the forgotten languages of myth and symbol and alchemy. But this recording reveals what the textbooks never dared acknowledge, a hypothesis he had long buried or perhaps protected, like some dangerous knowledge. His final forbidden question echoes across the decades. Could the human psyche survive the death of the body itself? The tape begins with distortion fading into clarity, and then his voice emerges, weathered by years but steady with conviction. He speaks not as a mystic, he clarifies, but as a physician of the soul, a man who has spent more than 50 years truly listening to the dreams of thousands. He has heard the dying dreams of men in hospital beds, witnessed the hallucinatory whispers of the schizophrenic mind, and attended to those quiet voices that visit us when the ego dissolves into something older, colder, and infinitely more complete. What he must share, he explains, through the static, is neither theory nor belief, but pattern, something recurring and independent of culture, language, or personal trauma. Across patients and continents, he has documented images of death that speak not of ending, but of transformation, visions that whisper of return rather than dissolution. The unsettling gravity in his voice stems not from mysticism, but from precision itself. Jung was no spiritualist seeking comfort in the supernatural. He rejected seances with disdain, despised charlatans who preyed upon grief, and dismissed much of the occult as a wasteland of projection and wishful thinking. Yet, through decades of clinical practice, he kept meticulous notes, documenting patient files and symbols that recurred in death visions, preserving mandalas sketched by the terminally ill with shaking hands. He once confided to a colleague that the unconscious is not limited to personal history, that it may not even be bound to the constraints of life itself. The recording turns confessional as he recounts his own brush with mortality in 1944, when his heart failed and he floated above his dying body in that Zurich hospital room. He describes seeing Earth from an impossible vantage point in space, observing a temple made of ancient stone poised high above the planet's curve. He felt himself drawn toward this architectural impossibility, yet somehow knew with absolute certainty that he would return to his failing flesh. A voice told him his work remained unfinished, and so he descended back into life. This near-death experience became part of his published memoir, but here, on this forbidden tape, he reveals the deeper truth that haunted him. It was not a hallucination but structured reality, ordered and archetypal, bearing the exact same architectural elements he had documented in the dreams of the dying, down to the stone steps of the temple and the guardian figure at the threshold. That overwhelming sense of returning home to a place never before seen, yet intimately familiar. He cites specific cases from his years at the Bergolsli Psychiatric Clinic, patients whose visions defied rational explanation. One woman with no religious background described an enormous wheel of light rotating in perfect silence, pulling her consciousness into its luminous center. A man spoke of descending a staircase beneath the ocean floor, where the dead were not gone but waiting in patient assembly. These are not metaphors, Jung insists through the recording's gentle hiss, but field phenomena of the psyche itself, data points in a larger pattern that science has yet to acknowledge. When asked directly about his belief in an afterlife, Jung pauses before answering that belief is too poor a word for what he has observed. Instead, he speaks of phenomena statistically improbable to the point of being intolerable to ignore, suggesting that consciousness as we understand it may not be merely epiphenomenal, but embedded within the very structure of the cosmos. The tape crackles violently here, possibly edited, but when it stabilizes, he is mid-thought, discussing symbols older than humanity itself. The cross, the circle, the axis mundi that emerges spontaneously, even in those who have never encountered such imagery. He wonders aloud if the psyche exists within a field, not unlike the electromagnetic fields, described by his correspondent Wolfgang Pauli, the Nobel laureate whose 1,000+ letters explored the intersection of quantum theory and depth psychology. In this model, the brain serves not as consciousness's producer, but as its receiver, a biological antenna tuned to frequencies beyond current scientific understanding. Jung recalls sharing his 1944 vision with Pauli, who responded not with skepticism, but with scientific poetry, suggesting that death might represent the collapse of the waveform that sustains individual ego, leaving behind not annihilation, but decoherence. The room falls silent except for the recorder's mechanical heartbeat. Leaning closer to the microphone, Jung delivers his most startling assertion, that the afterlife is neither Christian, nor Hindu, nor Egyptian in nature, but psychic and mathematical in its fundamental essence. We are symbols that have learned to believe themselves flesh, and when the body finally falls away, the symbol itself remains, eternal and indestructible. His tone shifts from clinical observation to deep reflection as he recalls his hospital years, witnessing death countless times, yet never once observing a true ending, only thresholds crossed and boundaries dissolved. Men spoke to dead wives as if they stood beside their beds. Children dying of tuberculosis whispered of silver staircases ascending into light. These are not delusions born of oxygen-starved brains, Jung argues, but data points in humanity's greatest mystery. As the tape reaches its conclusion, clicking toward silence, his final words emerge as barely a whisper. We must stop confusing the map with the territory, recognizing that what we call ghosts are merely residue, what we call heaven is simply structure, and what we call death is only the shedding of the smallest part of ourselves, leaving the vast remainder to continue its journey through dimensions we have yet to imagine or understand. The tape resumes with a voice quieter now, more intimate, as though weighted by secrets too profound for ordinary telling. The problem, he whispers into the darkness, is not death itself, but modernity's pathological refusal to look directly at it, to acknowledge what waits beyond the thin membrane of consciousness we mistake for all of reality. We have placed our faith entirely in matter, in the solid comfort of the tangible world. But what is matter when you strip away its illusions? A brilliant physicist once confided that matter is nothing more than frozen mystery, and we pretend it is solid, predictable, dead, but when you peer closely enough into the atom, into the firing neuron, into the landscape of dreams, it dissolves like morning mist, and something else entirely begins to speak in languages we have forgotten how to hear. For decades, he had dedicated his life not to the study of neurons or synapses, but to the observation of symbols, those strange images that arise unbidden from the unconscious depths of dying minds. They emerge in the dreams of the terminally ill with such uncanny consistency that patterns began to reveal themselves, mathematical in their precision, appearing identically in those who had never met, never read the same books, never been taught a single myth or story. These he called archetypes. But now he wondered if they were more than mere psychological constructs, if they were ontological structures woven into the very fabric of reality itself, blueprints for existence that transcend individual consciousness. When pressed about the reality of an afterlife, he does not answer with the certainty of faith, but with the measured restraint of a scientist who has witnessed phenomena that defy conventional explanation. Consciousness, he suggests, is not local to the brain, but behaves more like a field, an invisible force that extends beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone, and if that field persists beyond death, then what becomes of the essence it contains? He begins to recount cases drawn from decades of documented sessions, real encounters with the dying, that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of existence. A man in 1932 awakened from a deep coma just moments before his final breath, and spoke of crossing a river of mirrors where he encountered the version of himself he had forgotten, the person he might have been before life carved away his possibilities. Another patient in 1946 described a landscape of pure geometry, moving cubes of light and spheres that sang with voices like crystal chimes. Visions reported under no influence of drugs or suggestion, each one feeling to the dying person more vivid and real than any waking experience they had ever known. But it is when he returns to his own brush with death in 1944 that the atmosphere grows electric with possibility and terror. The experience did not feel symbolic or metaphorical, but devastatingly real as he floated above the Earth, watching blue oceans curve along the planet's edge, while approaching a massive stone structure older than time itself, suspended impossibly in the void of space. As he drew near, a presence neither benevolent nor hostile, but absolutely certain, stopped him with words that would echo through the remaining decades of his life. "You may return, but you will never be the same." And he wasn't, because he had seen that place before in the dreams of others, and after that day, patterns previously invisible began to emerge, like constellations forming in a darkening sky. The dying brain, skeptics argue, creates hallucinations as it shuts down, but he had documented the dreams of terminal patients from 1938 to 1955, filtering carefully for religious bias and cultural expectation, and what remained were strange constants that appeared again and again. The approach of brilliant light, great doors opening onto infinite spaces, circular symbols spinning with hypnotic precision, symmetrical forms that seemed to pulse with their own inner life. These were not metaphors born from failing minds, but maps, detailed charts of territories that exist beyond the borders of ordinary consciousness. In unpublished notebooks now archived and locked away, he had sketched diagrams attempting to map these psychic transitions, pathways he called the axis of return, that traced the journey from ego to self, from individual form to universal essence. The pattern was always the same, always a spiral ascending towards something vast and incomprehensible. During a summer evening in 1951, he shared with a physicist friend the dream of a patient who had seen atoms singing at the edge of death, and the response was startling. "That sounds like quantum decoherence, a collapse into base frequency," and they had laughed nervously at the possibility that death might simply be a retuning of consciousness, a slipping out of local phase into the universal wave function that connects all things. Death, he concluded, might not be an ending but a change in resonance, a shift from one frequency of existence to another. When asked why such revelations remained hidden in private notebooks rather than proclaimed to the world, his answer carries the weight of a man who understood the cost of truth spoken too soon. The church would condemn it as heresy, while scientists would dismiss it as pseudoscience, so he placed these insights where they could wait patiently until humanity was ready to hear them without flinching away in fear or denial. "We have confused facts with truth," he observes, with the weariness of someone who has spent a lifetime bridging two worlds that refuse to acknowledge each other's existence. The universe is not made of atoms alone, but of meaning itself, and meaning does not vanish with the death of the body, but lingers, reconfigures, and finds new forms of expression. A letter from an elderly woman who had lost her son in war described a dream where the boy stood at a luminous shore, waving farewell before transforming into a beam of pure white light, and when she asked if this was goodbye, the response was precise rather than poetic. No, this was recognition, the moment when love transcends the boundaries of physical existence. Every assertion is grounded in case notes and correspondence, in the mathematics of brilliant minds who dared to question the nature of reality itself. If we continue ignoring the inner world, reducing consciousness to mere chemical reactions, we will suffer not because the science is wrong, but because it remains tragically incomplete. Consciousness is not a side effect of matter, but its mirror, reflecting depths we have barely begun to explore. The great patterns he called archetypes, the mother and hero and shadow, do not die with individual minds, but pass on like genetic information, structures of being that persist beyond the dissolution of flesh. Sometimes he suspected the afterlife is not a place at all, but a pattern into which we are eventually reabsorbed, returning to the source from which all consciousness springs. The tape cuts to static with final words that hang in the darkness like a benediction or warning. We are not our thoughts, but what dreams us into existence, again and again, across the vast spiral of time. The tape begins again, and this time the silence carries weight. The mechanical whisper of reels turning slowly, deliberately, as if the machine itself understands the gravity of what is about to be revealed. When the voice emerges from the static, it carries decades of careful observation, the measured cadence of a man who has spent his life standing at the threshold between the known and the unknowable. These are not thoughts shared in crowded lecture halls or published in peer-reviewed journals. These are confessions kept in shadow, not from shame, but from a profound reverence for truths too fragile for the harsh light of academic scrutiny. To speak of the soul's continuation beyond death is to step into territory where the rigid boundaries of science dissolve, where empirical method meets primordial knowing, where equations dance with dreams in ways that make skeptics uncomfortable and believers tremble. Listen carefully to what comes next, because it challenges everything our modern world has taught us to accept as real. We live in an age that has drawn artificial lines between what can be measured and what truly matters, between the quantifiable and the profound. We embrace gravity without ever touching its essence, accept the flow of time without ever seeing its passage. Yet when the deepest parts of human consciousness speak of their own persistence beyond bodily death, when dreams align with mathematical possibilities in ways that defy explanation, we retreat into comfortable denial. We dismiss these experiences as coincidence, as wishful thinking, or in our darkest moments of intellectual arrogance, as evidence of mental instability. But what if we are wrong? What if our dismissal is itself the delusion? The voice continues with startling directness, speaking of ghosts not as the phantoms of popular imagination, but as something far more profound and terrifying in its implications. These are not the theatrical spirits of haunted houses or gothic tales, but psychic residue, energetic imprints, consciousness-shaped fields that persist long after the biological vessel has ceased to function. These impressions, carved into the fabric of reality by intense emotion or unfinished psychological business, represent what he calls energetic truths, phenomena that have been witnessed, documented, and experienced by countless individuals across cultures and centuries. Consider the case that haunted him for years, a woman in Zurich who found herself visited nightly in dreams by figures standing at the edge of her bed, weeks before receiving word of her estranged father's death. The precision of her visions was unnervingly exact. She described not the man as she remembered him from years past, but as he appeared in his final moments, discovered days later in a hospice outside Basel. In her last dream before his death, he spoke a single phrase that would echo through the years: "I am untying the knot." No model in neuroscience can account for such experiences. No evolutionary advantage explains our capacity to know the dying and the dead. Yet these experiences persist, documented across every culture, every era, every attempt to rationalize them away. The scientific implications become even more unsettling when considered through the lens of quantum mechanics. A brilliant physicist once wrote in a private letter that if consciousness itself behaves like a quantum system, if awareness operates according to the same principles that govern subatomic particles, then perhaps what we call death is simply the collapse of one wave function and the emergence of another. What is unmeasured, he suggested, is not non-existent but merely unseen, existing in a state of potential that transcends our current ability to detect or understand. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing question of all: what actually happens when we die? The answer that emerges from these hidden recordings is both comforting and terrifying in its implications. We return, but not as the collection of memories and personality traits we mistake for our true selves. Not as ego, that fragile construction of identity we spend our lives defending and defining. We return as pattern, as the underlying structure that dreamed us into existence in the first place. The ego is merely a spark, a brief flicker of individual awareness, but the deeper self, the archetypal foundation of consciousness itself, is the eternal fire from which all sparks emerge, and to which they inevitably return. This challenges our most fundamental assumptions about individuality and death. We live under the illusion that we are separate, distinct, unique entities moving through an indifferent universe. But what if we are instead temporary expressions of timeless patterns, brief manifestations of archetypal forces that have been shaping human experience since consciousness first emerged? The mother dies, but motherhood persists. The hero falls, but heroism continues to inspire. These are not merely metaphorical truths, but literal descriptions of how consciousness operates across time, how psychic energy reorganizes itself rather than simply disappearing. In his final years, he sketched a diagram he never published, a visual representation of what he called the soul after the body. It depicted not the linear progression of traditional afterlife concepts, not an upward journey to heaven or downward descent to hell, but a spiral moving inward, each layer bringing consciousness closer to what can only be described as pure essence. This geometric understanding of post-mortem existence suggests that death is not an ending but an unfolding, not a departure but a deeper arrival at the source of all being. The implications extend far beyond individual mortality to challenge the entire materialist worldview that dominates modern thinking. We cannot dissect meaning in a laboratory or extract purpose from neural tissue, yet we continue trying, searching for the soul in gray matter when perhaps it is precisely the reverse. Perhaps physical reality is the echo of psychic reality, not its source. This represents a complete inversion of everything we have been taught to believe about the relationship between mind and matter, consciousness and brain, soul and body. As these hidden recordings draw to a close, they leave us with an unsettling possibility that we are not who we think we are, that consciousness is not an accidental byproduct of neural complexity but its ultimate source, that death is not erasure but transformation, and perhaps most disturbing of all, that the awareness experiencing these words right now has already died and been reborn countless times, carrying forward patterns too deep for conscious memory, too essential for biological death to touch.